Hi, good evening. This is towards the missing link that we were looking for, or perhaps the missing link that I sort of missed, I guess. This is to understand more about the link between the two school of thoughts. So I would like to apologize for everybody, or to everybody rather, about this missing parts, and I hope I could make it up. And it was such a failure on my part to do it so while I was very or romanticizing the other theorists and other school of thoughts. So here it is, linking between the humanism and existentialism through the lens of psychology. I call it the missing link. Now, between the 1920s and 30s, at these times, the structuralism in psychoanalysis, behaviorism, functionalism, and Gestalt, they coexisted in the early 20th century. However, they sort of like faded, some of them faded, or even meshed with other school of thoughts. So, the only one prominent at these times were the behaviorism and the psychoanalysis, which remained influential with its school of thought. But these school of thoughts were challenging since it felt that it sort of neglected the human aspect or the human attributes, or the human forgot to touch the human uniqueness of it. So most psychologists before were concerned about, well, most psychologists were concerned about abnormal and the ill, and forgot to acknowledge the basic needs before addressing the higher needs. Maslow urged people to acknowledge the basic needs before addressing the higher needs, and ultimately self-actualization. He wanted to know what constituted positive mental health, and also touched on the human psychology, which gave rise to several different kinds of therapy, as we all know, which is all guided by the idea of people possess the inner resources for growth and healing. And the point of the therapy is to remove obstacles to individuals individuals achieving them. So in the 1960s, this is where the journey begins. So I mentioned earlier, I was talking about Maslow. So here it is. Now, Maslow was born in 1980 and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And Maslow was the oldest of the seven children. His parents were the first generation of Jewish immigrants from Kiev, or the Russian Empire, which is now called Ukraine. Very, very political also. Even nowadays, it has a specific conflict or a specific political agenda between Ukraine and U.S. relations, who fled from the Czarist prosecution in the early 20th century. They had decided to live in New York, and in a multi-ethnic or a working class neighborhood. His parents were poor and not intellectually focused, but they valued education. He had various encounters with anti-Semitic, since he's coming from a Jewish background. Anti-Semitic gangs would chase and throw rocks at him. So Maslow and the other young people with his background were struggling to overcome such acts of racism and ethnic prejudice in an attempt to establish an idealistic world on the widespread education and economic justice. So basically, they were hoping to have the American dream, but when they got there, they were having problems with the racism part of it, and then people were sort of, even at those times, racism was already, or actually existing. So It started the movement, Abraham Maslow started the movement Third Force, claimed that the behaviorism and psychoanalysis neglected a number of important human attributes, which I mentioned earlier in the missing link parts. He was best known for a hierarchy of needs, a theory of psychological health predicated on fulfilling innate human needs in priority culminating in self-actualization. He stressed the importance of focusing on positive qualities in people as opposed to treating them as ill or disturbed. He stressed the importance of focusing rather on the positive qualities in people as opposed to treating them as a bag of symptoms. Now, growing up, the tension outside his home was also felt within. It was not only having problems, he was not having problems outside, but also inside his home. He rarely got along with his mother and eventually developed a strong revulsion towards her. And he also quoted that what I had reacted to was not only her physical appearance, but her values and the worldview. Her stinginess, total selfishness, lack of love for anyone else in the world, even her own husband and children. So there was this dysfunctional dynamics that he had within his home. Her narcissism, and take note, her Negro prejudice, which was already existing. Even it's a prejudice within the prejudice. Even there were prejudice against Jews. Also, there were Negro prejudice, and her anyone else in this world. So her exploitation to everyone. Her assumption that anyone was wrong who disagreed with her, and her lack of friends, her sloppiness and dirtiness, something like that of some sort. And he also grew with a few friends other than his cousins, and as a result, his mother would. There was this incident that his mother would sort of lock the refrigerator, and would only open it up depending on the mood of the mother. Now his parents were named Samuel and Rose, which his father, on the other hand, mentioned him as ugly. So he was sort of degrading him. So there seemed to have problems within the family or within. Now, I sort of like described it as like they were so ghetto that their mom, during the time when Maslow saw some kittens and he sort of adopted it, but his mom sort of like killed those kittens in front of him, some sort. Now in 1926 he began taking legal studies or legal class in addition to his undergraduate course load. Now he did this to satisfy his father, but he hated it and almost immediately dropped out. In 1927, he transferred to Cornell, which he left after just one semester due to his poor grades and sort of high cost or expenses. Now, this is where he met and attended the intro course or introductory course by Titchener, as we mentioned earlier in some previous School of Thoughts. Maslow attended college New York he was only 17. He attended City College of New York. After graduated from the city, he went to University of Wisconsin and then studied psychology, where he experienced behaviorism and would leave him with a strong positivist mindset. Now he had two daughters named Anne and Ellen. Yeah, similarly Anna and Elsa. So this it's called Anne and Ellen. In 1928, he married his first cousin, Bertha, who was still in high school at that time. The pair had met in Brooklyn years ago. This was the first time he enrolled at the university. Now, his time in University of Wisconsin, Maslow's psychology training at the UW, or University of Wisconsin, decidedly with was decidedly experimental and a behaviorist perspective. At Wisconsin, he pursued a line of research which included investigating primate dominance and sexuality. Now, his time at Columbia University was just around 18 months, where he worked before Wisconsin. His time with Columbia University was around 18 months, and he was working with Thorndike. So Maslow was already familiar with the pillars, or the what do you call that, famous psychologists or behaviorists during that time. Now, his thesis on the 1931 was awarded his master's degree in psychology, but he was sort of ashamed that he sort of removed it from psychology library and tore it out in his catalog listings. However, Professor Kaysen admired the research enough to urge Maslow to submit it for publication. Maslow's thesis was published as 2 articles in 1934. So in 1930, he finished BA in psychology. 1931, he had MA in psychology. In 1934, he had a PhD in psychology. So he was really in line with psychology. He was the first graduate of under Harry Harlow, which was an experimental psychologist, and continued his research at Columbia University, where he sort of like had 18 months under Thorndike. So there he found another mentor inside there, which is a mentor in Alfred Adler and then Sigmund Freud's early colleagues. Now, as a career as a teacher, after World War II, Maslow began the way psychologists have come to their conclusions. Although he did not completely disagree, he had his own ideas on how to understand human mind. Maslow was already a 33-year-old father and had 2 children, Elsa, Anne and Ellen, I think. And however, it was the time of during that time, in 1941, it was World War II. So he was ineligible for military since he's already old enough, or 33 years old, so he became ineligible for military. However, the horrors of war inspired a vision of peace in him, leading to his groundbreaking psychological studies of self-actualizing. So it was these times during the World War II. Studies began under the supervision of his 2 mentors, which was an anthropologist named Ruth Benedict and a Gestalt psychologist, which was Max Wertheimer, whom he admired both professionally and personally. So he was already having a relationship with the greats. So Maslow had a serious heart attack during along this period. He had a serious heart attack and knew that his time was limited. So he considered himself to be a psychological pioneer and gave future psychologists a push by bringing the light to different paths to ponder. So he built a framework then later allowed other psychologists to conduct more comprehensive studies. Maslow believed that the leadership should be non-intervening. So consistent with this approach, he rejected a nomination in 1963 to be a president of the APA for humanistic psychology, because he felt that the organization should develop an intellectual movement without a leader. So from 1937 to 1951, Maslow was on the faculty of Brooklyn College. He called his new discipline humanistic psychology. So aside from mental health and human potential, he borrowed ideas from different psychologists and adding new ones such as concepts of hierarchy of needs, meta-motivation, self-actualizing persons, and peak experiences. So it was seen all around, mostly in universities, and having worked or under study with other famous psychologists. So he sort of, with those experiences from hopping, sort of like hopping universities, he was gathering also informations and sort of like what Freud did during his time. So until his death, while jogging, Maslow suffered a severe heart attack and died on June 8, 1970, at the age of 62 in Menlo Park, California, which is buried in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. So now we were looking at the relationships of the Maslow. So we call it the third force. So let's think about what the third force is all about. Now, it is known as the third force. Why? Because the first force was Freudian determinism. Your behavior is determined by the unconscious. And the second force was more of behaviorism. Your behavior is determined by your environment. And the third force embraces the human freedom and forces of self-actualization, which both is humanism and existentialism, and which is more of transpersonal psychology. So that's the third force is all about. Now this is where the humanistic psychology began, as a response of to the limitations of Freud's psychoanalytic theory and B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, which left with its roots running from. So now we're sort of taking the missing link here. So running from the roots of Socrates through the Renaissance that emphasizes the individual's drive towards self-actualization